Hello everyone and welcome. But before we start, and mainly before I even forget, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat at any time. And our moderator, who is Professor Zaida Godoy Navarro from the Sustainability Council, will be your voice at the end of the session, and we will do our best to answer all questions. So I am Dr. Deborah Berhanu. I am an associate professor of material science at the Fashion Institute of Technology. And I have the pleasure today to introduce you to Lauren Ritchie, a student in sustainable development at Columbia University and founder of the Eco-Justice Project. Lauren relentlessly works to raise awareness and support her community and peers. And her Black Girl Blueprint podcasts, Lauren explores topics ranging from catcalls to religious upbringing or the influence of culture. Those are some that just popped to my eyes. Some that I could actually not even understand the title. I guess I'm too old. And discussions I wish I had heard when I was younger, like moving on and letting go of things which are very important as we evolve in our lives and in our careers. So today I have the honor to converse with Lauren about sustainability and our actions and responsibilities as individuals, citizens, and members of our communities. And most of the time when we face a challenge, especially one that surpasses our individual and family scale, we are overwhelmed. And we don't even know where to start addressing a problem. So question like how to stop climate change, or what can I do to make fashion more sustainable? And many just think, well, I can't do anything about this. This is too big of a problem. And they just stop. But some people, like Lauren, they actually try and tackle that problem. And I believe that they are overcoming these issues step by step. And in general, they value progress over perfection, which allows them to take actions. And today, we will talk to Lauren Ritchie, a young social and eco activist who has impressed many. And her work has been featured by many already, including the Malala Fund and Michelle Obama Foundation. And so I will ask you, Lauren, to please tell us about you and where did you grow up and how did you get involved in all these projects that we will talk about in more details later on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, first and foremost, to you, Deborah, to Karen, everyone who organized this, for having me. It's such a great pleasure to have this conversation. I talk about sustainability all the time in my free time, so it's just great to have this type of forum to have these conversations. And I think, yeah, like you were saying, like climate action and inspiring people to get involved is such a big part of this work. It's a big task associated with being involved in this line of work because it is so overwhelming and jargon filled, as you said. But for me, it really began very early. I started participating in beach cleanups. I'm from the Bahamas, and I grew up there, and the natural environment was around me all the time. So I grew up going to beaches. I went to the mangroves. I went snorkeling at the coral reefs, and I'm like, this means so much to me. And my home also suffers a lot from hurricanes, especially my sophomore year of college. 2019 was when Hurricane Dorian happened, and it just stayed over my island. The destruction was absolutely unfathomable. So I think after, my courses in sustainable development here at Columbia, my upbringing in the Bahamas, and just, what was going on, I think, in my country at that time, and just how it was mismatching a lot, I think, with what I was learning in my classrooms compared to how people were approaching sustainability on my island, just made me really want to get involved. And I think being in an academic space and learning this information is so different from being on the ground. It's different from living that experience every day. And I wanted to bridge that gap with the Eco Justice Project. I also wanted to reach out to young people, especially both through the Eco Justice and through my podcast. I don't think that Gen Z are the next generation. I think we're here, and I think we're already making such a big impact. And I think being able to highlight young people in all the work that we do, but also being able to use social media, use all these like mediums of activism that have also like are recently emerging. Like a couple years ago, you wouldn't imagine this surge of like infographics and, you know, digestible information online. So it was really important for me to be a part of that movement, to be a part of education and just bringing these voices and stories of marginalized communities and Caribbean communities and communities of color to the forefront, I think, to really show the nuance and how complex this issue really is.
So can I say that the one of the major impacts that actually got you to be involved are the hurricanes, experiencing that as
I
drove you
think
to it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think the hurricanes definitely, but I've been having hurricanes for my entire life, and I think, you know, you grow up in hurricanes. Like I remember being 3 years old, and at that time we lived in this really tall apartment building. I was on the 11th floor, and it's swaying, and that's like one of the childhood memories that's ingrained into me.
Yeah.
So I think I always had that background and that knowledge. I think it was more the contrast of me having that background and perspective and then coming to America, coming to my classroom at Columbia, and no one's getting it. Everyone's really desensitized. No one like understands that lived experience. And I'm looking around and all my teachers are white, all my classmates are white, you know, and no one's, even the people who have been to the Bahamas who have done climate action work have not been talking to locals. They've been going there and flashing their degree. And, you know, I think there was just a lot of just a very big gap, I think, in filling that bridge between education and reaching these communities and allowing them to tell their stories. You know, I think storytelling and communications is just so important. So I think wanting for more people who looked like me to have that platform was very important.
It's you always seem to work at that, like I don't know, I want to call it like a borderline, right? It's so you talk about eco justice, and so you talk about the Black Girl Blueprint, but I
Mhm.
mean you're involved in a film, a documentary, right? With a future as a future rising fellow,
Mhm.
you started the Columbia Climate Conversation, so you're really involved in a variety of projects. So my question would be for you, do you think that these are related and you can kind of see I'm trying to get to the to climate justice and social justice aspect of things, or do you think that these projects are how can I say related among them, or do you see them as battles of a same war? Do you see like a common goal at the end, or do you actually just see them as completely separate goals that you are different challenges that you are just fighting with each project?
No, absolutely. I think something that I'm so grateful for in all of the projects that I've been able to pour myself into is that they do cover these different spheres, right? Like you were saying with Black Girl Blueprint, there are these conversations about pop culture. It's, you know, about cultivating a community of young Black women who haven't had this type of resource before to hear people their age, their peers talking about these issues and what it's like to be a Black girl in that lived experience and have it shown on that stage. But there's also, you know, Columbia Climate Conversations, which is conversations about intersectionality and environmentalism. It's conversations, you know, about all of these social interactions with climate and social identities. And then Eco Justice Project is kind of the same thing with education. And then the documentary as well that I'm creating is about a neighborhood in Brooklyn, and the housing injustice going on there, and how there's, you know, government organizations that are trying to do this climate planning with, you know, this recovery and resilience programs because of hurricanes that are happening, and it's overwhelming the community and having these really detrimental impacts because of the way that it was done without talking to the community. So I can see how these projects are very tangential, I think, in a lot of different ways. You have like podcasts, you have social media, there's even writing and journalism and film. But I think something that's been so gratifying, I think, about having this be a part of my undergrad experience is that I see sustainability a lot more, I think, as a representation of my moral values and what I think the world should look like, and less so having to be tied to the mediums that I choose to express it. Like I love fashion since I'm here at FIT. Like I really love film. I really love, you know, social media and engaging with pop culture. And I think to your point and getting back to the question about climate justice, you know, I think it's difficult for people when sustainability has been very narrow in a lot of ways in terms of the environmental justice movement, thinking about the natural environment in terms of trees. You get oceans, whales, animals, and that's been a lot of the narrative, I think, around sustainability. But when you actually, break it down to how complex this issue is, like it affects people, it affects our food systems, our public health, it affects, our water, like natural disasters, even gender equity and disabilities have a role to play in how people are impacted by the climate crisis. So when I'm able to do this work with the Eco Justice Project or with the film or even with Black Girl Blueprint and cultivating a community for Black girls or being to express, our grievances about institutional and systemic injustice going on for young Black women, all of these go together for me because I think they are mediums that allow me to talk about this issue of climate justice, but also from a lens that I think that tackles a lot of the institutional and systemic issues that perpetrate and worsen the climate crisis. And I think being able to make those intersections and connections to which things make the climate crisis worse for certain individuals, or why certain individuals aren't able to, recuperate, why certain individuals don't, get the same attention when it comes to having resources. There's just so much nuance, and I don't want to keep talking in case you have other questions, but it's been very fulfilling, I think, because I think climate and social work just go hand in hand so seamlessly, and it's been nice to have these avenues to show how they blend together.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, you're naturally going to the questions I am asking you anyway. So don't worry if you keep talking. It's a pleasure. One way that I tend to introduce environmental justice when we have discussions in class, as a scientist, it's some news event or something would actually come up, and we would start talking about this, and often I introduce it as there are injustices,
Mm-hmm.
environmental injustices, and that's why we have environmental justice movements. So it's the injustice is the one that creates the need for justice, and that's how the activism arises. And setting up these facts can often help students and people to kind of get a context on why we talk about social justice and climate justice together. And but it is true that most of the time some may ask, why would a hurricane just affects everybody? Why would it affect more someone
Mm-hmm.
who is financially secure versus someone who is already economically burdened? And there are actually like specific examples that we can discuss, but can you tell us more about this? You started talking about it, but why are some overburdened by climate change? Why are they? And you talked about the differences, including with disabilities. And
Mm-hmm.
can you go a bit more into that subject, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, Environmental justice is it's a broad concept, and I think it's a lot more of a movement, like you said, rather than, just this buzzword that I think it's been thrown around as in a lot of ways. And I think breaking it down to what it really means is the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of systems and institutions in place that oppress certain communities of people, whether that's, people of color, whether that's poor people, whether that's people with disabilities, women, even refugees and immigrants. There's just so many different social intersections that impact the way that you're able to move through the world and what resources are available at your disposal. Even thinking about houses, which communities you live in, what's the air like in those communities, what's the water like, what does your day-to-day commute even look like, thinking about subway deserts in New York City, you're trying, accessibility and trying to get to work, and even thinking about, opportunities to be sustainable or practice, sustainable practice are just not available to certain communities. So there's a certain nuance, I think, if you don't have access to funding or if you're living in an underprivileged community, when a natural disaster happens, you don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the financial security nets, especially thinking about gender equity, which is something that people often don't think about in terms of climate change or girls' education. I'd recently been having a conversation with Girl Rising about that, especially. I'd recommend the documentary as well if anyone wants to watch it. But just there's so many different just ways that this impacts just yes how you're able to recover from a storm, how you're able to feed yourself, your family, also what you're able to prioritize, in terms of how you go about your day-to-day life. It's just very much tied up in these different institutions, and that's why certain communities bear the burden, despite contributing also the least to the climate crisis in a lot of different ways. When you think about, Caribbean islands, especially, this is where, a lot of the weather disasters are happening, but also there's a lot of colonialism left over from, these ties countries. The economy isn't self-sustaining. There's neocolonialism, there's capitalism, there's also just white supremacy as well. And I think in the way that impacts imperialism and exploitation and just a general, culture around sustainability that at the end of the day just exploits people of color, but also, when the climate crisis does happen, it's very, very difficult to recover and the burden's just so much worse.
Absolutely. I was not a few months ago. I was listening to this. It was a meeting about the specific practical aspects of the how some communities are overburdened, and you make very valid points. It's especially if we talk about insurance, who gets better
Yeah,
insurance?
exactly.
It's those who have the financial means to. So even in very practical terms, the cost of the repairs, there was a specific example that stayed in my mind. It's about, if you have $1 million house versus $100,000 house, and comparing it. So, for example, the extent of damage, will it be worse on the $100,000 house or on the $1 million house? And then will the insurance reimburse $100,000 to someone who owns $100,000 house, which would be 100% of that of the actual price, or to someone who has $1 million? And so these practical questions actually make it even more obvious without even considering a more global aspect as you're talking about. And I think it's very important to look at it from a global perspective, and how different the history of countries and communities, etc. But even on the most practical aspects of things, I think people should question the overburden of some communities over others. I really appreciate your global outlook at the subject. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you work with communities? How do you get to empower people, especially when it comes to these communities? I don't want to say to these communities, but to us communities who may have been overburdened in lots of ways. It can be women, it can be Black women, it can be the poor economical backgrounds in general. There is a mistrust or a distrust of the system. So how do you get them to engage in a subject that often also requires some education and understanding of global factors like this? So how do you work practically in these type of very complex, really, scenarios yet at such a young age?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think first and foremost, I'm in navigating these spaces, I think I do have a certain amount of, I don't want to call it privilege, but I think in terms of navigating conversations about, about the climate crisis, about like what it's like to be underrepresented, what it's like to be a Black woman in those spaces, I have a certain privilege in being able to connect because that's also my lived experience. Whereas I think someone who hadn't had that lived experience coming in to talk to people, it might be more difficult to connect in the same way. But I think even on that, there is still the tension in that I don't have everyone's lived experience, or even the fact that I'm at Columbia now and I'm able to be in these academic spaces, or even the ivory tower that is the Ivy League and what that means. There's a certain amount of privilege there, even in trying to communicate with like my family back home is a big tension that I encountered, especially after 2 years, at Columbia. I'm just like, I've learned so much and I would love to share this with you. And, trying to come across in a way that's not condescending and a way that's very, has a lot of grace, I think is very important. And meeting people where they're at is also very important. And I've just found that just trying to talk to people as people has been so beneficial. I think, especially thinking about the nuance that you have when it comes to sustainability, you're trying to inspire people, to get involved and to, have some type of climate action, sustainable fashion, even, for example, you try to get people to be more sustainable and you understand the problems associated with fast fashion, you understand, the exploitation, you understand the environmental impact. But the reality of the matter is ethical fashion is hundreds of dollars. Broke college students are not affording that. You know what I mean? Or even ethical fashion often has limited ranges of styles, even, but also in terms of sizes. Plus size folks, in terms of, having extensive access to fashion because people want to be confident and like their clothes, most of that, representation in terms of size inclusivity is being found in these brands, and it's affordable, and even thrifting is becoming inaccessible. And I think we can't really rely on this one size fits all idea of sustainability. And when you approach conversations about sustainability with this kind of tolerance and open-mindedness, I find that people are a lot more receptive to dialogue. And I think that's, where productive conversation ensues. And also thinking about the documentary that I'm making in Red Hook, that was one of the main things that we talked about, and was also very important to me, I think, even in thinking of the concept of this documentary, is that I'd worked with Red Hook in one of my classes the semester prior, and I'd already had this fellowship. They were like, make some type of storytelling project about whatever you'd liked. And I got really attached to Red Hook because I was in charge of doing the community outreach project there for the class. And I just spent so much time talking to the community, and they were, sharing all of this stuff about, the health and safety hazard, what it's like, the risks of living in this community and how devastating it was. But they were also saying how much they tried to talk to government officials about their issues, how much they'd just been, screaming into the void, or how even people had come and extracted their stories and not, they hadn't seen any change. So I think that is something that's important to recognize as well. Even in one of my classes, there was an example of this professor who had been working in this community, and they'd been taking a lot of lead samples, and they'd, realized that there were high levels of lead in the soil. But it took a while for them to realize, oh, we should actually help. We should actually do something about this. Like, helping was an afterthought to the research. And this is becoming a little tangential, but basically what I'm trying to say is it's really important, I think, in this work to be open-minded and open to dialogue and meeting people where they're at, but also, making sure that your intentions are genuine, and making sure that you actually want to help, and just that you're, willing to try your best. And like you were saying, progress over perfection, I think is a good segue into that part of the conversation. But I think that's very, very helpful in terms of dealing with communities and getting people to have hope again. These are people whose communities have been devastated, and they've been trying for years, for decades, and nothing's changing. So yeah, in terms of gaining their trust, just be genuine and be open, I'd say.
It's striking to me how you're really active. Obviously, you just go for things and you get things achieved. I was listening to this lady who was trying to help during that after the Hurricane Katrina, and one of the problems she was facing was that so the some of the funding that she was applying for to help the people who had been affected heavily by the hurricane, her fund requests were not being accepted, and she just couldn't understand why, because it just didn't make sense. And in the end, she realized it's because she was using Excel spreadsheets,
Mm,
and that was not an acceptable format for whatever bureaucracy it was going through. But that took years
yeah.
for her to actually, because she had to resubmit it several times, because these the timeline of some of these funding requests, etc., are not based on people being affected with emergency situations. And so would you describe yourself as some type of bridge between,
Hmm.
a system that has completely lost this humanity, I would say? Would you describe yourself as some bridging mechanism, or would you see yourself differently?
I think so. I mean, I've never articulated it that eloquently, but I think I've definitely had that type of feeling in a lot of ways. Especially one aspect of being a bridge is, I feel like, a bridge between whatever life that I've built for myself here in the US and my family and community back home. That's one gap that I feel like I'm bridging, but also, there's the age gap as well. I come into these spaces, and I'm often the youngest person in the room. I'm also the only Black person in the room, sometimes the only woman in the room. And I think there's a lot of intersecting identities that I have as a very young Black Caribbean woman, that when I go into these spaces, a lot of times I do feel like I'm advocating on behalf of a lot of different identities that I hold. And there's a certain pressure in that, obviously, and I could never claim or try to be a representation for all of these different groups, but there's also a certain privilege, I think, in being able to bring those stories to these places where these stories haven't been heard before. Like I moderated a panel with a completely white audience, and I was like, we're going to do a completely POC panel, and we're going to talk about environmental justice, and no one here at this panel is going to even know what that is, but they will after they leave. And I think reaching people who wouldn't otherwise be reached is also something that's very important to me. I really like education, and I like, being having these different mediums like podcasts and journalism and films that are just so accessible to reaching a broad array of demographics of people. So yeah, I think I definitely feel like a bridge. Even at Columbia with Columbia Climate Conversations, I came into that after being in, the Sustainable Development Department as an undergrad for 2 years. And I was just like, none of the undergrads know what's going on. You guys are doing cool work, but nobody understands. And I'm like, we should make something that the undergraduates will want to engage with. And now they come to the events when we have them. And it's been some of the best turnout that the Earth Institute has seen, but it's just been so nice, especially because the faculty hasn't engaged with these perspectives before, because the panels are entirely people of color. They're entirely indigenous folks. We're talking about disabilities and climate change. You're having a panel entirely of people under the age of 18. Like, when else are you going to hear these perspectives? Now, you're going to hear them now, and I'm going to make sure that you hear them. And that feels very fulfilling to me, but it is very bridge-like, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yes, I mean, I'm using the word, using what you're describing to me. To be honest with you, it's what I get from you. That was feeding my description of your actions. Um, I think. I mean, I don't know if we have questions already. Zaida, okay.
No, not yet, not yet. But maybe it's
Okay.
a good time to remind our attendees that they can always please write your questions in the chat. See.
Yes. I think one very important aspect is setting the conversation, which is what you're talking about. And setting the conversation is very important. And then you can always build on top of any conversation. And I completely agree with you with education. And so it's not, I mean, it's not a surprise to me that one of the goals, when the sustainability goals, education of women, especially, is part of the most important ones that were set by the UN. It's very important for us to understand the need for education globally as well, because this problem is not a problem that we can solve on our own, as you described very well. It's even those who are overburdened are not the ones who have polluted the most. It's the consequences are affecting much more those societies that have not used the energy as much, or used plastic as much, or so it's very important that we educate people, and we kind of tackle all of this. Would you say that we are, I almost want to start a generation war now, would you say that we are kind of not acting enough, and your generation is actually pushing things forward? And I'm asking you this because obviously because I would like to hear that, but to hear your opinion about that, but also because there is a real rise of youth activism. So what is it that made this rise? Is it the pandemic? Is it simply the inertia of previous generations? What is it that triggered this increase in youth activism?
Right. Well, I will say on the age wars, I'm for the peace. I don't have any qualms with older generations. I think I older generations have had their own battles to fight, have had, I mean, a lot of them have been constant, obviously, but I think, every generation presents its own challenges and their own idea of solutions. My only gripes come in when there is the age war, and I think there are a lot of older people who don't trust youth activism. I think I've encountered this a lot with social media, especially just not being taken seriously. And I think, in the sphere of activism that has often been associated with a lot of grassroots work, or has been associated with like protests and in the streets type of action, or just even like journalism. I think these are more like have been like longer lasting forms of activism and advocacy. And then all of a sudden you have, TikTok, you have like social media, and you have people who are making 7-second videos breaking down a concept that you could, you would read in an entire academic journal. You know what I mean? They're doing such work that often gets discredited as maybe too silly or too youthful in a lot of ways. But when you really break down what youth activism or even social media activism is at its core, it's a hard task, especially as someone who's been doing it. Trying to break down something so complex into a 7-second video takes a lot of skill, and you have to understand something very well to be able to even put it into such a creative format, to be able to move something that's been kind of locked up in academia for so long and break it into these creative spheres. It's a hard feat, and I think Gen Z has taken on the task. In terms of what has mobilized this type of action, I think Gen Z is tired, and I think it probably has a lot to do with the fact that we grew up in the age of the internet in a lot of ways. And I think, especially thinking for myself, growing up around so much technology, I feel like I've watched the world evolve so rapidly during my lifetime, or thinking about what, even like cell phones 10 years ago compared to now, like our entire lives are on these things. And to a certain extent, I think in terms of empowerment as a young person, I feel like everything's within my grasp. Don't know if that's a personal thing for me, but I think a lot of young people feel that way, that just anything's possible. We've seen so many wild, bizarre things happen, and we're like, we can make this change if we want to. People are getting famous for posting TikToks in their bedroom. It's like, I can be a part of this movement too, and no action is that small. And I think that's very much a mindset that Gen Z has. And again, I think we get critiqued for it, for being too idealistic, for being too, I don't know, trying to be too out of the box. But I thrive off of creativity, and this feels like the right generation for me. Or maybe I'm a product of my generation. Maybe it's both. We'll see.
I really like how you're not going. I would have probably wanted you to go a bit further and say, oh yeah, you're all old and don't realize. But I actually really like what you said about taking these very established, I would say, topics and putting them into a movie, as you said, is very hard, which is something I never realized because I didn't even try and make one, to be honest with you. So, but you're right. And also getting the vocabulary to, because it's exactly what we do, right? We're teaching, and we're teaching at different levels. That's exactly what we do. So it is a very difficult task that you're tackling. It's very important to say that, because I will be honest with you, I had not realized it. I think you're right as well on the fact that we all have our how can I say, our battles that we've had to go through as generations. I completely agree, but I like how you express this feeling that you have, that everything is right there for you, and I think that's a huge difference. I really think it is. I am kind of lucky that I grew up traveling, but it's definitely something that has become much more normal for everyone. And also, you can literally just travel by being on your phone. You can see so much more of life than than any one of the previous generations have done, and exchange ideas. Because for me, the most major changes have always occurred when you meet people who are really different. By meeting people who are all the same, I don't think that we can evolve as much. And I think your generation really has that global vision, which may allow us to tackle real global issues as well. And like, small national identities or based type of thinking, I think you really are the first generation who can claim a more global understanding of any problem. So,
I
yeah.
agree. Yep. I think a lot of that does have to do with like social media. I think my friends and I talk about a lot how just how much we can know about strangers. I could just be, on my phone when I wake up in the morning, and I'm hearing someone's entire inner monologue, or I just learned about, I don't know, some random fact about someone's life somewhere in a state or a country very, very far away, and we have so much access to other people. And I think there's something about Gen Z that makes us feel more confident to tell our stories. Maybe these are all wrapped up in each other, but for some reason we have a certain, I don't want to call it pride or like conceit. There's a certain like narcissistic-ish quality about us that makes it feel like everyone must listen to us, or that, you know, we deserve for our voices to be heard, which again, we are critiqued for, but I think there is a certain value in that. And I think because you have so many young people who feel so much comfort to be able to share their lives on the internet, especially even thinking about when I was in middle school in 2014 when Tumblr was popular. I was maybe 12 years old and everyone was sharing their life stories on the internet. And I think that created a culture around that type of oversharing on the internet. But I wonder if what you were saying about this type of globalist like idea of the world that we have, or a certain empathy I think that our generation has for other people, or a value for diversity. Again, I don't know where it comes from, but it is a trend where I think Gen Z are a lot more tolerant and accepting, and I wonder how much of that does have to do with just growing up seeing so much about other people's lives. Like we grew up knowing so much about the outside world, I feel like, in a way that a lot of generations didn't have as much access to. So that exposure, I think, yeah, has cultivated that type of mindset, which I think will be very beneficial um, in the long run.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciated the conversation. I'm going to ask if anyone in the panel has any question.
Oh, so Preeti has a question, so let me read it for you, Lauren. So Preeti wants to say, hi, Lauren, I'm simply honored to hear you talk. Please keep up the good work. And then she's sharing some information. We are doing a peace protest against petroleum fibers on the 30th of April. Sorry, sorry, Preeti, that I don't think I could unmute you. So that's why we were asking you to write the questions there. So she's asking if you would like to join, or if you have some advice for the peace protest.
That sounds wonderful. Also, thank you, Preeti. Is that how you pronounce your name? That sounds wonderful. I hope it's a great peaceful protest. Be safe. Thank you for your great work. In terms of joining, I'm perhaps I don't know if I'll be in New York for that weekend because I'm also graduating very soon, and I have a panel in Colorado, I think, around that time. Yes, to graduation. But in terms of advice, I mean, stay safe. I think, yeah, you're doing very, very, very great work. I don't have particular advice, I think, in terms for a peaceful protest. But enjoy. Have a good time.
And there doesn't seem to be more questions, but Deborah, if you will allow me, because we still have a few minutes, maybe I could ask you something, Lauren.
Of course.
I'm thinking of, we teach, right? We teachers here. So I was trying to, I can't help it, but I do make connections, about what your work is and what we do. And I was wondering if you could, maybe I'm going to make you think about something that you haven't thought before here, but you think you could share some, I'm thinking of activities, right? Because that's what we do in class. You come with an activity. So for you, maybe it would be actions, or, some actions that you have led that you think were successful, that you had engagement, that kind of, if you were in a classroom, it would have worked, and maybe even the opposite, if you wouldn't mind sharing some actions that you learned from because they didn't work, they didn't take you where you thought they would.
Do you mean specifically in a classroom setting or just generally?
I actually mean generally, but this is, I'm being honest to you, this is my teacher.
Your teacher hat. No, I understand. I understand. No, that's completely fair. Things that I've found to be successful. I think, again, with Gen Z, the age of the internet and this era of TikTok also gives people very, very short attention spans. I think things that I've found most successful in my work have been things that are very short. I think whether that's like a short like video or like an infographic with like a couple slides, those tend to perform well, especially if the front of the slide is very flashy and easily shareable. I think that's, especially with social media, activism or any type of online advocacy, I think shareability is what really spreads messages. So I think if you have something that people can easily share in their stories or distribute, I think that gets the message to more people. In terms of activities that I think work, I'm a sucker for a good panel. I love a conversation. I think there's something very fulfilling, I think, about being able to hear someone speak, especially in an informal setting. I recently, I think it was yesterday actually, there's a club at Columbia with a bunch of students and like especially freshmen and sophomores in sustainable development, and they organize these like coffee chat office hours where you can just come in and talk about sustainability. But even if you had it more as a more structured setting, I think any conversations tend to bring people in and engage people more, I think, than readings do, at least in my experience in a classroom setting. And also just, yeah, activities. I wish we were still in high school. I'd tell you to let your kids play Kahoot and Jeopardy. I think that those are always good tasks for learning things, but just anything that I think is generally engaging and gets people, involved in a way and excited, I think is very beneficial. I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Well, I want to say congratulations, Lauren, for all your accomplishments and including your graduation, which sounds like a small achievement compared to everything you've done, but it's yet not a small achievement at all.
Thank you very much.
And of course, I wish you a most amazing future, which is already right there in front of you. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This
accepting.
Yes, no, this is an absolute pleasure. Thank you so, so much, Deborah. And yes, to Karen and to you as well, Saida, thank you for organizing this. It was wonderful. I hope you'll have a lovely day.
Thank you to the Sustainability Council. And thank you for everyone for attending.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Deborah, you can hit stop on the recording, please.
Okay.